In December of 2020, I closed the book on a pretty big chapter in my life. A 3-year actual play RPG web show called Resident Roleplay, based on the Resident Evil video games. In hindsight, there were many things I would have done differently, but also many things that couldn't have turned out any better. I suppose that goes with the territory. Resident Roleplay was the first campaign I'd ever run, and to start, it was new and exciting, but as with any new craft, I was bound to make mistakes. So I wanted to look back and review the campaign as a whole and share some of the things I've been reflecting on, as well as the wisdom I've learned over the course of those 110 episodes. But first, a quick spoiler warning. Alright, lesson number 1. Set expectations. Before beginning Resident Roleplay, we ran a few pilot sessions to test both the technical aspects of the streaming and recording, as well as playtest the homebrewed system we were using. These test sessions were valuable as they gave me some starting experience as a GM and gave the players a feel for the system and my storytelling style. This was all well and good for figuring out our dynamic, but one thing I failed to do up front was give a proper preview of the campaign to come. At the start, the story was shrouded in mystery, due in part to the last-minute entry of half our cast members whose characters I had to hook in a hurry. Looking back, we were fortunate that the first few episodes went as smooth as they did. Aside from their characters' starting points, the players knew very little going into the premiere. If I were to do it again, I would be more upfront and prepared with a pitch giving the gist of the story, tone, and direction I wanted to head with the campaign as a whole. To borrow a corporate term, this is a process I now like to refer to as onboarding, and I now realize that it's incredibly valuable. So much of a player's enjoyment of a campaign is entirely dependent not on your ability as a GM, but rather whether it's a right fit for them at all. You can run your ideal grimdark campaign, but if the players showed up to play a utopia, then they're going to be disappointed no matter how good it is. That's why onboarding is so important. You need to clearly communicate the kind of story you want to tell to ensure you and the players are on the same page and signed up to play the same game before session 1 ever happens. If a group commits to a campaign with conflicting desires or ideas of what the game is supposed to be, then you're just going to end up making compromises that ruin the fun for everyone. Okay, second lesson. Communication is key. This is perhaps the most important lesson I've taken away. Any campaign lives or dies on the strength of your communication. First thing to communicate is intent, as I detailed before. Set expectations, communicate your vision, but beyond that, I would also prioritize consent. If you're going to delve into controversial narrative territory, or even styles of play that may make some players uncomfortable, such as difficult combat encounters, PvP scenarios, or situations that undermine player agency, then it is important to give fair warning and get everyone's permission beforehand. I didn't do this early on in Resident Roleplay, and it definitely led to some butting of heads. But later on, and especially in the final arc, I implemented consent gathering to pretty astonishing effect. I quickly realized that players will tolerate and even embrace way more crazy things than they otherwise would if they're simply asked first. Furthermore, being transparent with players about forthcoming events, and even collaborating with them to make impactful moments happen, are both powerful tools. As cool as it is to keep future plot points under wraps and surprise everyone at the table, there's something even cooler to be gained from giving one player partial spoilers in order to conspire with them. With their contribution, and their autonomy and their very presence as a player rather than a GM, they add gravity to certain payoffs that you can't achieve on your own. And that leads me to the next lesson. Collaborate. I think the entire cast agrees that the final story arc of Resident Roleplay is by far the best of the series, and a large part of that is owed to the frequent implementation of this tool. Nicole's betrayal, Enyo, Mr. G's mind control, and so many more moments were born out of player-GM collaboration. Rose came to me with the desire to play an android, and she asked if that would be feasible within the story world, and so I thought it through. Are androids a possibility within the world of Resident Evil? Well, the RE universe is no stranger to shockingly advanced, borderline science-fictional technology, including complex AIs and robotics. There's little in the canon that outright states the possibility of a full-bodied android, but all the prerequisites seem to be there. And when you add the Manifold, my fan-made villainous faction created for this campaign, which is led by a straight-up post-human cyberpunk mad scientist, then, yeah, androids are not at all beyond the realm of possibility. So I greenlit the idea, but with some limitations, in order to ease my conscience for doing something so boundary-breaking with the Resident Evil canon. Being a big Marvel Comics nerd, I took inspiration from Ultron in how Hank Pym created this advanced AI from a scan of his own brain patterns. I thought that's a good way of introducing a new sentient machine while curbing the disbelief of someone creating something so complex from complete scratch, while also serving the dual purpose of baking in defects that inevitably lead to conflict. So I crafted a bunch of homebrew to make it work, and allowed her to become Enyo on two big limitations. One, she is a creation of the Manifold, and having been based on Walker's brain patterns, she inherits Walker's flaws, which reads, "You are prideful, petty, and easily provoked to personal offense or anger," though she didn't know this was Walker's flaw at the time. And number two, she has a built-in expiration date through her countdown feature, which will gradually make her more powerful, but eventually cause her to overload and die. Let's take a look at the feature. I wrote countdown like this and sent it to her. "You feel a constant rumbling sensation within, emanating from the power core in your chest. You are programmed with an internal clock that begins counting down from the moment you come online. You do not know what will happen when it reaches 0. So, milestone number 1, upgrades. Enyo levels up to evolve to level 12 and gains a mutation of her choice. Milestone number 2, energy expulsion. Enyo's firearms gain unlimited ammo, reloads are still required, and deal flash damage instead of piercing. Her melee attacks deal an additional 2d6 flash damage on a hit. Milestone 3, laser blast. Enyo can cast the D&D spell Disintegrate at DC 18 against monsters and NPCs at will, dealing flash damage. If she is emotionally disturbed and her action is available, she must succeed a DC 15 Wisdom saving throw or use it unintentionally. And last but not least, milestone 4, Meltdown. Enyo's Manifold reactor goes into overdrive. For 10 minutes, she has a 60-foot fly speed and can take an action surge on every turn. At the end of 10 minutes, she self-destructs, causing a 25 megaton explosion. All objects, structures, and creatures within a 1-mile radius are destroyed. Creatures within 5 miles must make a DC 18 Constitution saving throw, taking 4d10 poison damage, gaining 2 points of fatigue, and gaining the poison condition on a fail, or half as much damage, only 1 point of fatigue, and not poisoned on a success. I wanted to account for all possibilities, so I included that level of detail into the rules for that thermonuclear explosion, but they, of course, didn't end up coming into play. So, at convenient narrative milestones, she would receive these upgrades one by one, not knowing what they would be until the day of. Then, in the epic battle at Langley, she receives her full meltdown mode. Though these factors were unknown to Rose, they were born out of her original pitch for an android character and the conversations I had with her about the limits it should come with for me to be fully comfortable integrating such a far-fetched concept. She provided the character, I provided the terms of the agreement, and together we created an arc. And this led to the Of Electric Sheep episode, which remains one of my all-time favorites of the campaign, where the repercussions of these factors plunge the entire group into this science-fictional, intellectual thought experiment of an episode, exploring the nature of consciousness and being through character and dialogue. It's absolutely brilliant. I love that episode so much. Alright, here's another example. Mr. G. As with all his characters, Lauren had sophisticated ideas of Mr. G and the themes he could explore. But one thing I don't think he expected was to use this character to create an almost autobiographical allegory. But through collaboration, we ended up there. When Aiden defeated Mr. G in the desert, which I completely didn't expect to happen, I made sure the finishing blow was dealt off-screen in order to speak with Lauren directly. I knew this was a character he had some attachment to, as well as big plans for, and though he usually embraces character death, I figured we were so late in the campaign that I should at least offer alternatives. So I met with Lauren and basically asked, would you prefer that this character die and bring in another one, or survive at a cost? And after some discussion, he decided on the latter. which led to the solo bonus episode Captive, which then planted the seeds that ultimately culminated in several climaxes. First, it made the battle at Langley in Meltdown even more multifaceted than it already was, being a combination of so many unexpected threads and collaborations. Seriously, that encounter was not originally planned to be that dope, but because Aiden survived, and because Enyo existed, and because Mr. G got mind controlled, all these organic narrative threads that had built up over the course of the story arc came to a head for one memorable encounter. I couldn't have written it any better, and I suppose that's the beauty of tabletop RPGs. These stories just emerge organically. But then the gift kept on giving. In the very next episode, this collaboration culminated again in The World Went Grey, which is quite possibly the most profound work of art I've ever had the luxury of GMing. Though to say I GM'd it is an overstatement, because that episode was driven almost entirely by the players. It is a brilliant, dramatic allegory exploring mental illness and the way different people and systems react to it, as well as the nature of empathy and agency. Simply put, it is a story about being human despite oneself. I won't go into much detail, but anyone who knows Lauren's personal history knows how that episode reflects him. And it makes me emotional just writing and talking about it for this video. To Lauren and I both, that is by far our favorite episode of the campaign, and it holds a pretty special place in our hearts. And so there you have two concrete examples of how GM and player collaboration enhances the story. When you start conspiring with players, you will find the door open to profound narrative possibilities that you could have never before imagined. All right, next up. Cater to the players. Everyone comes to the table with different wants. Some favor tactics and combat, others puzzling and exploration, and still others social encounters and politics. It's vital to balance these aspects in order to satisfy every player at the table. Really, this one's just a matter of understanding the storytelling principle of pacing. The RE games themselves sort of became the model of pacing that I used for Resident Roleplay, and that ended up working out quite well. It was moments of reprieve between moments of intensity, punctuated by moments of character and plot development and big action set pieces. That careful balance allows every player's taste to be satisfied at different points. And knowing your player's taste is just a matter of knowing your players. So if you're ever unsure, just ask them. Get to know them. Find out what brings them to the table. Are they here to kill monsters and make money? Or are they here to explore philosophical quandaries? Or maybe a bit of both. There are limits to this, of course. Like I said, communicate expectations. If one player's desires are simply incompatible with the rest of the table, then perhaps your game simply isn't for them, which can be tough to come to terms with if you consider that player a friend. But if what everyone else wants would make one player miserable, or vice versa, then perhaps they simply shouldn't be a part of that campaign to begin with. Okay, last one, and this was a huge takeaway for me. Don't let the system stand in your way. In hindsight, I should not have run Resident Roleplay as a D&D 5th edition conversion. The priorities of 5e are simply too different from the priorities of Resident Evil. One is about survival horror, the other is about heroic fantasy. And because the mechanics of 5e are designed for heroism, it shouldn't have surprised me that our story gradually conformed to that style. And so throughout the entire campaign, I felt this tension, where I had to wrestle with the system to tell the story I wanted to tell. Don't get me wrong, I still enjoyed it. And that progression worked well considering the RE video games actually took the same approach, starting the characters as survivors and gradually scaling them up to world-saving heroes. Yet still, there was a lot about 5e that got in the way of the atmospheric horror story I wanted to tell. And I stuck with it because, at the time, that was all I knew. One unintended consequence of 5th edition came from the narrative pacing that emerged from its experience system. D&D's XP distribution is clearly designed to incentivize long-term campaigns, which is antithetical to telling efficient stories. Even though I implemented house rules that greatly accelerated XP gain, I still found myself adding filler stories just to pad out the runtime and get the players leveled up appropriately to face the more important stories. And that was ultimately dissatisfying for me as an artist. I would much rather have told a more succinct, efficiently paced story. I started out with a particular vision of the overarching campaign narrative, but that eventually got dragged out for the sake of the system. Well, never again, I say. Don't let the system stand in your way. If you're trying to get to epic levels to tell your story, but the rules as written say that'll take a lifetime, then scrap that to implement whatever progression will create the pacing you need for your story. Because in the end, the system isn't your story. The system is a medium for telling your story, and if any part doesn't service the story, then it should be cut or modified. Okay, one last note on this system tension. The core gameplay loop of most RPGs, which revolves around this dialogue between players and GM, tends to give the impression that only the player characters' perspectives can be shown. Turns out, that's not true. In recent years, I've grown more comfortable with getting creative using third-person omniscient cinematics, and flash forwards, and other unconventional structure tools. This probably became apparent in the last few arcs of Resident Roleplay. In Arc 5, called The Gathering, we open with a flash forward to a mysterious injured figure washing up on a shore and being hospitalized. This turned out to be NPC Sean Lennox, surviving his encounter with the Manifold. Then at the end of Arc 5, I cut away to a brief teaser of the next and final arc, by showing our big bad Elliot Walker conversing with his ally Samuel Emerson in the Manifold Tower. I also foreshadow the return of Aiden in that cutscene. These are all useful narrative devices that technically break the rules, but turn out to be very intuitive and palatable to your players if they've ever seen a film or played a video game, so you needn't to be afraid to wield them. So that's it. Those are some of the biggest lessons I learned from my first long-form campaign, which lasted 3 whole years from 2017 to 2020. You can watch the entire campaign now, or catch up on the final arc through shorter recaps over on the P-Cubed YouTube channel. You'll find links for that all over the place. I sincerely hope you GMs found any of this useful. I've really grown passionate about the TTRPG hobby in recent years, so I'll likely be giving more GM advice on this channel in the future. Now, go forth and create. God bless. Thank you very much for watching. This is my personal channel where I share my thoughts and opinions. If you want to find my work, then don't stick around here. You want to head to my main channel, P-Cubed. Links in the doobly-doo.